Welcome back to Close Up. Last week, Governor Chris Sununu backed all 48 recommendations made by the Commission on Law Enforcement Accountability, Community, and Transparency. Some reforms are already underway. Others will be made soon via executive order, and the legislature will have to weigh in on potential law changes. Here to discuss the road ahead is James McKim, president of the Manchester NAACP, and Eddie Edwards, a retired longtime law enforcement and police chief, both members of the Lee Act Commission. Thanks for joining us this morning, gentlemen.
Thanks for having us, Adam.
And let's start with you, Mr. McKim. The governor is moving forward with this agenda at the state level, but there's a local element as well. How do you move this ball forward at the city and town level?
Well, that's a great question. And, you know, the work that we did on the commission, the hearings that we had really highlighted the difference between what can happen at the state level and the local level. And I think what we tried to recommend to the governor was to do whatever he can to really encourage local law enforcement to be as good as they can at making sure that they have training that is available, not just through the PTSC, the police training and standards, but allowing them to take the training that they need to be really up on implicit bias and de-escalation techniques. And what the governor can do is make some strong recommendations to local law enforcement as to how they should operate, and encourage the certification process and provide resources that towns might need to have their forces go through that certification process, which can be expensive for particularly those smaller towns who don't have that much of a budget.
And Mr. Edwards, from the law enforcement perspective, how much buy-in do you think there is going to be on the local and even in the department level?
Well, I think because of the way this commission was constructed, and I think we have to give the governor a lot of credit for taking the time to pull this commission together and have the number of voices reflected who had concerns about policing across the spectrum of the commission. And I think because the law enforcement community was well represented with their voice and their opinions, I think it will be well received. And I think what was revealed through this process, a lot of the things that were occurring in New Hampshire, we were on the leading edge of in law enforcement, but also where we needed to tweak, strengthen, and reshape and reform, law enforcement embraced. So I think it will be well received at the state level, county level, and local level.
Let's talk about some of the bigger changes that could be made if all of these recommendations are implemented and sort of put into law in some cases. First, an independent statewide oversight body to receive complaints about officers. Mr. McKim, how do you envision this working, and how much of that work do you think will end up being public?
Well, what I envision is what we really talked about, and that is a department within the Attorney General's office that really is focused on investigating misconduct. And there needs to be obviously some funding associated with that to create that department with the resources necessary to truly investigate those cases. And I think it could be very well received and very well operated. It takes a lot of the onus off of the individual law enforcement agencies to do this. And from my mind, it should be absolutely public in terms of the results of the investigation. And as with any investigation, you don't want to divulge everything that's going on during the investigation because speculation can happen, and you really do want to have all the facts in place before you make information public.
And Mr. Edwards, any concerns that this body could end up having too much power over police in New Hampshire, or is this exactly the kind of oversight that's needed?
Well, I think we examined this pretty rigorously, and I think that the system that is being examined, I think will be very effective. It will be built or structured and or created in the light that we see with attorneys, the attorney disciplinary system, where judges, prosecutors, defense attorneys are held to a standard. If that is the model that is created, then I think it will be beneficial to law enforcement. A lot of law enforcement officers, for instance, are wanting to make sure that there's due process. That's what they want, to make sure the system offers due process, where they're treated fairly in the process. And if an officer has truly violated the law, abused their authority, they should be held accountable to that. And I think the commission was uniform in their voice on that particular issue.
Let's talk about something that is not in the recommendations, and that's qualified immunity. What's your perspective on this legal protection, Mr. McKim? Is the status quo too tilted in the favor of the officer right now?
Well, I think I was a little disappointed that we didn't make a recommendation to study this further. We heard some testimony on it that there are some challenges, and it's actually complex because qualified immunity, as we heard, is a federal policy and set of statutes, as opposed to what's referred to as official immunity, which was created through a judicial law from a case that was here in New Hampshire. So it's a very complex issue, and I think there really does need to be some more investigation on it. Attorney Chuck Douglas testified that there are actually protections sufficient in current law to protect officers, yet still allow for cases to be brought against them if there was potential misconduct. But as a commission, we didn't quite agree on whether that should be carried forth or whether discussion should be carried forth. So, and I think we could have spent a lot more time on it than we did. But in the end, we just said it's too complicated for us to really say anything about.
Mr. Edwards, what are your thoughts on qualified immunity? Can an officer do their job if they're always thinking, oh, wait a second, I might get sued for this?
Well, first of all, I think we have to really understand what qualified immunity really says. Qualified immunity does not protect incompetency. It does not protect intentional or knowingly acts. So if you can imagine, if you pick up the phone and you call for help, you're calling for help for your wife or your children, and that officer is responding thinking that I may face a potential lawsuit because I have used my discretion in a way that someone is going to judge the next day on the light and the conditions when they had the opportunity to gather all of the facts. I think the courts have recognized this back in 1967 when the doctrine was first established. There's a way, and police officers are held accountable. We can't let it go unsaid that police officers aren't held accountable. Right here in New Hampshire, if a criminal act is committed by a police officer, he or she is prosecuted. We've seen cases like that right here in our own state. The accountability in the department is at a high standard. Most law enforcement officers are judged harshly by their peers when they step off the line. Because why? The entire underpinning of law enforcement rests on integrity. When that integrity is disrupted or threatened, it is a black mark for the entire law enforcement community. And so I think law enforcement officers are much more harsh on their peers when there is a problem.
When it comes to the community building side of this, what can law enforcement in New Hampshire do better to connect with communities of color? And we'll start with you, Mr. McKim.
Well, I think following the examples of what's going on in Nashua and what's going on in Manchester, and we actually had a testimony from Lieutenant Camacho from Nashua that talked about the youth programs and the Mirror program, the Mirror effort that is happening there that's really engaging youth with law enforcement and building the relationships that are so necessary to build that trust in law enforcement. And so we actually did have some recommendations around departments, law enforcement agencies, possibly identifying a community relations individual or a representative whose sole, maybe not sole purpose, but had a focus on building relationships between law enforcement and the community.
What about recruitment, Mr. Edwards? Do you think a young Eddie Edwards would still be interested in law enforcement in this environment right now?
Well, I think it goes back to a point Mr. Kim spoke of a moment ago, right? It goes back to some of the efforts that have been undertaken by community organizations. And I would have to say the State Advisory Group on Juvenile Justice developed the Mirror Project and effective interaction with policing. Those projects, programs were developed by community people and put into place for law enforcement. And I think for me, if I were, it's a little unfair for me to answer that question because even as a young man, I view law enforcement officers as heroes because they intervened in my life in a very different way, perhaps more so than most. They stopped the pain that my mother was experiencing. They were very kind and gentle to me. So I've always had an affection for law enforcement. But I think it takes those type of officers who are engaged in that way. Lieutenant Camacho, who oversees that program throughout the state now, and we're working on having that program actually transferred to police standards and training, so we can ensure that all school resource officers, for instance, receive that type of training. But what it comes down to is the type of police officers, the men and women who work in law enforcement, who want to invest in their community by reaching out to their community and earning the respect of their community. I think police officers work hard every day to do that. And that is why I was thrilled and proud to be a member of law enforcement.
And one of the romantic ideals of America is the idea of e pluribus unum, out of many, one. And certainly this commission set a good example on that front. And hopefully all of us can learn from the discussions that went forward with you guys. So James McKim, Eddie Edwards, thank you so much for your time and your perspective here on Close Up.
Thank you.
Thank you for having